Hey guys, so CEs are one of the most overlooked mechanics for newer players, despite being one of the most impactful. I wanted to make a quick video guide going over CEs, what constitutes a good CE, and how to effectively level your CEs. So, what are CEs? CEs are essentially quote unquote gear you can equip to your servants for various buffs and other effects. Taking a quick look at the structure of a CE, you'll see it has a level, an HP and attack stat, and a skill the CE applies, usually to the servant it's equipped to. A few things to note here. First off, you can do something called limit breaking a CE, which is the act of feeding a copy of the same CE to it in order to increase its max level. After you feed 4 different copies of a CE to itself, it will become max limit broken, which allows it to be leveled up to its maximum level, as well as increases the effectiveness of the CE's skill. One more thing of note is the attack and HP stat. These stats are given directly to the servant holding the CE, and they increase as you level the CE. Different CEs have different stat focuses, meaning some CEs will only increase the attack stat, some the HP stat, and some will split focus and increase both. I'll get into it more towards the end of the video, but it's usually better to have a CE that solely focuses on one stat or the other. Next, we'll talk about what makes a good CE, starting with CEs for your DPS servants and then your support servants. So, what constitutes a good CE? Well, that answer can vary drastically depending on the context of what you're doing. But a good rule of thumb is that you want a CE that has focus. Take this CE on the screen, for example. I would, generally speaking, consider the effects of the CE to be suboptimal. You'll see it has MP damage up, which would imply you're taking this on a servant you intend to NP with. However, it also has quicken arts up. This may initially sound like a good thing, particularly to newer players, but the thing is, when you have CEs that boost multiple damage types like this, it usually comes at the cost of boosting the damage less than it would if it were only one damage type. In the context of this CE, that's particularly not good because it's a CE focused on MP damage, and ignoring 2 or 3 servants, your MP typing is not going to change in the middle of the fight. If you're using a servant with a damage-oriented arts NP, you'd much rather have a CE that solely focuses on arts. And while we're on the topic, you'll see that most in-game players use CEs that only focus on one card typing for their main DPS, even if they're using, say, a crit-oriented character. This is because late game is reliant on you boosting your damage with supports, and a lot of the meta-defining supports only focus on one card typing, which really incentivizes players to focus on one card type if they want to dish out as much DPS as possible. So on the screen now, we have what is considered one of the best CEs in the game, at least for a DPS. It's a welfare CE that boosts buster damage, increases MP damage, and starts you out with 50% MP charge. As you can see, this CE has a clear, well-defined purpose, which is deal more buster MP damage. It's also worth noting that this CE has pure attack scaling, which can make a significant difference to your damage depending on how much the CE has been leveled up. I'll quickly go over how I usually go about choosing a CE for my DPS units. Again, this is a very general example and doesn't take into account what kind of content you're clearing, nor the kit of the servant you're using. So in order of priority, I first look for a CE that has a buff to the card type of the servant I'm trying to use. So if I'm using an arts-oriented servant, I'm going to look for a CE that buffs arts damage. Next, I determine if I need starting MP charge, and then whittle down my options based on that. Afterwards, I look to see if the CEs have critical damage up or MP damage up, and select the one that's most relevant to the type of damage I'm trying to deal. This is usually tied to the DPS you're using, so for example, Super Orion would benefit most from using a crit-oriented CE, while someone like Space Ishtar would usually prefer a more MP-focused one. You should also note if the CE is attack or HP scaling, but that's less important unless the CE is a fairly high level. Most people won't have a CE cater made for every situation they're in, so just try to get as many of the relevant buffs as possible. Again, this advice is as general as it gets and takes very little into account, but it's the best generic advice I can give. There's CEs like Black Grail and Kaleidoscope that seem bad when you compare them to the advice I just gave, but Black Grail is the best CE on someone like Kama in most situations just because of the amount of built-in quick buffs Kama already has. Just to elaborate for newer players, some buffs in the game stack additively, while some stack multiplicatively. I'll put a chart up on the screen now that shows this more in depth, but generally speaking, you prefer to stack buffs of multiple different types, as opposed to just stacking the same ones over and over again. Moving on, K-Scope, while not offering any damage modification, is single-handedly the most important CE when it comes to most types of looping, namely because of its massive starting MP charge and pure attack stat. There's even situations where you might want to take more defensive CEs to stop your servant from dying to certain mechanics before they can actually finish the fight. It is very situational. Moving on to CEs for your more support-oriented servants, I'm going to make this very quick, not because support CEs are easier to point out, but because the CEs you use here are so situational, I think it's pointless for me to try and over-explain. I'll quickly go over some examples of good support CEs, but this is extremely situational, and in most cases you're going to have to rely on your own judgment to figure out what to take. Also, just to clarify, when I say support CEs, I'm talking about CEs for servants like Scotty, Merlin, Hans, Helena, not CEs for your support list. So for starters, support CEs should offer utility in some way, usually in the form of survivability, self MP gain, or boosting the damage of your DPS in some manner. For farming and easier content, I recommend just taking shop CEs like this or this. These help a lot for farming their respective resources, and for easier content, you're not really going to need utility. If you're farming an event, you can also use a CE that boosts event drops. For damage boosting, it kind of depends on your DPS. If you're using a crit-oriented DPS, 20-30 is usually your best bet, but any other CE that offers immediate crit stars or crit star generation is going to be useful. Other than that, there aren't many CEs in the game that can boost the damage of other servants, with some notable exceptions being Ox Demon King, and some CEs during events, such as this CE during Saber Wars 2. K-Scope or other starting MP/MP generation CEs are good if your support has a good MP you want to fire off as often as possible. And lastly, support-oriented servants usually have bond CEs that, when equipped to them, will boost the damage of everyone on the field in some way. There's so many of these that vary in effect that I can't really get too into it, but it's worth checking out what CEs your supports get at Bond 10, and whether or not it's something you want to grind out. Not really much advice I can give on support CEs, sadly. The examples I gave above are usually good, but the nature of utility is that it's heavily based on the context of the situation, meaning it's very hard for me to give generalized advice. So moving on to leveling CEs. First off, which CEs are worth leveling? Generally, you'll want to prioritize CEs you frequently use on your DPS and that have pure attack stat scaling. You usually don't want to level CEs that have split scaling, since that means you're going to be getting significantly less attack when compared to a CE that only focuses on attack. CEs that only scale HP are generally not worth leveling at all after you max limit break them, particularly if the skills of the CE are offensive in nature. HP is by no means a useless stat, but you get a lot more bang for your buck when you level attack scaling CEs, and the stat increases from them tend to be a lot more influential overall. So leveling a CE isn't much different from leveling a servant. You just feed other CEs into them, and you gain XP relative to the level of the CEs fed. However, leveling 5-star CEs becomes very expensive later on, and if you're just blindly feeding your excess CEs into your 5-star CEs, you'll become broke very quickly. The cost of leveling CEs scales based on the rarity of the CE you're leveling. A 1-star CE will cost significantly less than leveling a 5-star CE. This has led to the creation of what is known as a CE bomb. CE bombs, while maybe seeming a bit complex at first, are actually pretty simple and straightforward to make. When you level a CE, it keeps track of the cumulative amount of XP that has been fed into it, If you then turn around and feed your leveled up CE into another CE, the new CE will gain all the cumulative XP that the original CE had acquired. So if I have a level 50 CE and I used it to level another CE, the CE being leveled will gain the amount of XP it took to level the CE being fed to 50. I should point out that the cumulative XP isn't affected by great or super success. It always remains a stagnant number, so if my prior example were to result in a super success, the amount of XP the new CE would gain is still roughly the same. Back to CE bombs. A CE bomb is basically using this concept to level a 1-star CE really high and then feeding the 1-star CE to a 5-star to gain its cumulative XP. This results in you gaining the same amount of XP as you would have gained if you had used the same resources to level the 5-star CE as you did the 1-star CE, but it cost you significantly less QP to do so. I'll quickly throw up an example of me making a CE bomb on the screen. If I were to use all these CEs to level up my 5-star CE, it would cost a lot. However, I can MLB a 1-star CE, feed the exact same amount of resources to the 1-star CE, and then turn around and feed the 1-star CE to the 5-star CE for roughly the same amount of XP at a fraction of the QP cost. As you can see, the super success has no impact on the amount of XP being transferred over from the CE bomb. I'll link a video of someone going over CE bombs a little more in depth, but hopefully my explanation gives you a good general idea of how to make them. Anyways, that about wraps up this CE guide. Like I said, it's hard to give advice regarding CEs just because of how situational they can be, but hopefully this video can help act as a good starting point for anyone who's, lost in the sauce, so to speak. If you want more situation-specific advice, feel free to drop a comment or you can hop into our Discord and I'll try my best to help you out. But either way, I hope you guys enjoyed the video and I will see you again in the next one. Later.